In the summer heat of 1943, deep inside the nerve center of Germany's Eastern War, officers bent over maps that had begun to feel cursed. The great bulge in the front line around Kursk lay on the table like an exposed artery. A year earlier, a bold stroke might have seemed inevitable. Now, every pencil mark felt like a wager made with shrinking odds. Reports kept arriving, rail traffic counted in the east. Unit identifications pulled from prisoner interrogations. Aerial photographs of new trenches, gun pits, and camouflage tank parks. The enemy, they were told, was not fading. The enemy was rebuilding. Again, for many of Germany's generals, this was the most dangerous kind of news, not a surprise attack, not a single defeat, but the collapse of an assumption that had carried them across hundreds of miles of Soviet territory. If the Red Army could regenerate after disaster, then what exactly had Germany conquered? And if the Red Army was truly rebuilding faster than Germany could destroy it, what did victory even mean anymore? The question hung over every operational discussion. Could Germany still seize the initiative, or had the war already turned into something that could not be won? By the end of this story, the viewer will understand how German commanders and their intelligence apparatus came to recognize, piece by piece, that the Red Army was not merely surviving, it was reconstructing itself into an instrument of war stronger than before. You will see why the German campaign plans of 1942 and 1943 were built on expectations that proved fatally optimistic, how Soviet manpower and industry were reorganized under extreme pressure, and how the moment of realization spread through German headquarters like a slow, unavoidable dread. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union with the confidence of a state that believed it had solved the problem of modern war. The Wehrmacht's opening blows were shattering. Entire Soviet formations were encircled. Captured equipment littered roads. Millions of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. To German eyes, the numbers were so immense that they seemed to represent an ending an army collapsing in real time. The German High Command had reasons, on paper, to believe this would be decisive. They expected the Soviet system to fracture under the combined pressure of military defeat and territorial loss. They expected political chaos. They expected, above all, that the Red Army, humiliated by purges, caught unprepared, bleeding divisions at a scale few armies could survive, would reach a point where it simply could not reform. But the Soviet Union was not only a battlefield. It was a state built to absorb violence and then convert suffering into mobilization. The regime did not need to preserve comfort or consensus to continue fighting. It needed only to keep the apparatus running: factories, railroads, commissariats, recruitment offices, training grounds long enough to rebuild. And in 1941, even as German spearheads drove east, the Soviet leadership began shifting the foundations of its war economy away from the front. Factories were dismantled and sent into the interior. Machinery, workers, engineers, and partially completed production lines were moved by rail to regions beyond immediate German reach. It was an operation of staggering scale carried out under conditions that would have broken many governments' shortages, bomb damage, panic, and a front that kept moving. For German commanders watching from the west, it was easy to see only what lay before them: abandoned plants, captured cities, and enemy units apparently dissolving. What was happening beyond their view was the creation of a new industrial base, one that would not be as vulnerable to sudden collapse. Even so, the first year of the war made it tempting for German generals to believe the Soviet Union was living on borrowed time. Every week brought another report of enemy losses. Every advance seemed to validate the idea that the Red Army's reserves must be nearing exhaustion. And when the Wehrmacht reached the approaches to Moscow in late 1941, the campaign's original logic still held: one more push, one more encirclement, and the Soviet state might break. Then winter arrived, and with it, an event that began to fracture German certainty: the Soviet counteroffensive before Moscow. Fresh Soviet units appeared where German staffs believed there could be none. The counterattack did not merely slow the German advance. It forced a retreat in sectors where retreat had become psychologically unthinkable. German soldiers stretched thin. freezing, exhausted, and short of supplies, faced an enemy that seemed to gain strength as the temperature fell. The counteroffensive did not mean the Red Army had suddenly become tactically superior everywhere. Soviet losses remained severe. Soviet attacks were often costly. But the deeper message was unmistakable. The enemy still had operational reserves. The enemy still had the capacity to assemble new formations and throw them into decisive action. The Red Army, in the German imagination, was supposed to be a one-time structure smash-it, and it stays smashed. Moscow suggested otherwise, and yet, even then, the temptation remained to interpret the Soviet resurgence as an anomaly, a final effort, the last reserve scraped together. It is one of war's most persistent illusions, that the enemy's strength has a ceiling, and that ceiling is close. The year 1942 became the proving ground for that illusion. Germany's new plan in the east focused on the south, on the Don Basin, the Volga, and the oil fields of the Caucasus reflected a belief that the Soviet Union was weakened enough to be forced into strategic failure, capture the resources, sever the arteries, take the oil, cut the Volga traffic, and the Soviet war machine would begin to starve. It was a plan that carried a kind of cold logic, but it was also a plan that assumed time was on Germany's side. Time was not on Germany's side. The deeper Germany drove into the Soviet Union, the more the war ceased to resemble the swift campaigns of the early years. Distances expanded. Rail gauges differed. Roads disintegrated into mud or dust. Vehicles wore out. Spare parts vanished. And every mile gained created another mile that needed to be guarded against partisans, against counterattacks, against the simple failure of supply. German generals knew these facts. They could see them daily. But what they could not fully see, what they did not want to believe, was that the Soviet Union was turning the same time factor into a weapon. Every month the war continued was another month for evacuated industry to restart, another month for new conscripts to be trained, another month for lessons to be gathered from catastrophe and turned into new doctrine. If 1941 had been the year of Soviet survival, 1942 was the year of Soviet reconstruction under fire. German intelligence tried to measure what was happening. On paper, the German Army's intelligence services devoted to the Eastern Front sought to identify Soviet units, count divisions, estimate manpower pools, and assess equipment production. They relied on prisoner interrogations, captured documents, radio intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and reports from the front. They built order of battle charts, tracked unit insignia, and watched rail movement as a signal of massing forces. But intelligence is not merely collection. It is interpretation. And interpretation is shaped by belief. From the beginning, German planning had been influenced by the assumption that the Soviet Union's capacity for regeneration was limited. Even when evidence suggested otherwise, the mind searched for reasons to keep the original framework intact. A new Soviet army appears? Perhaps it is under strength. A new tank unit is reported? Perhaps it is assembled from damaged vehicles and lacks fuel. A sudden concentration of artillery is detected? Perhaps it is a local effort, not a strategic build. This is how false comfort is built, not from lies, but from the selective weighting of truth. By mid-1942, German armies advanced towards Stalingrad, and the city became both a symbol and a trap. The battle there consumed German attention, German supplies, German operational flexibility, and while German formations fought street by street, the Soviet High Command prepared a response that depended on something. Germany had repeatedly underestimated the ability to generate and conceal mass. The Soviet counterstroke at Stalingrad launched against the flanks held by Germany's allied armies did not arise from improvisation alone. It required coordination, logistics, artillery concentration, tank and mechanized forces, and enough trained manpower to exploit breakthroughs. It required, most of all, the presence of reserves that German commanders had not fully believed could exist in that quantity at that time. When the Soviet offensive struck, the shock was not only tactical, it was conceptual. The speed of collapse on the flanks and the depth of the Soviet thrust revealed a grim reality. The Red Army could still conduct large-scale operational maneuvers. Not just desperate defense, German generals watched as the encirclement closed around the Sixth Army. They saw the front lines around them bend and snap. And in the following weeks, as relief efforts faltered and supplies dwindled, the question became unavoidable. How had the enemy assembled this much force without Germany stopping it? The answers were painful. German reconnaissance had limitations. The steppe was vast. The Red Army grew increasingly skilled at camouflage, deception, and maskerovka, hiding real concentrations behind decoys and strict radio discipline. Soviet forces used night movements, weather, and terrain to reduce detection. German aerial reconnaissance, constrained by weather, distance, and aircraft availability, could not reliably map everything. Prisoners could mislead or simply not know. Radio intercepts could be incomplete. And German commanders had often prioritized immediate tactical needs over deeper operational warning, because they were always short of time and always fighting the crisis in front of them. But there was another reason, less technical and more human: a reluctance to accept that the enemy they thought they had crippled was now capable of strategic recovery. Stalingrad did not merely destroy a German army. It destroyed a story Germany had told itself about the Eastern War, yet even after Stalingrad, the danger of misreading the Soviet rebuild remained. It was possible, psychologically comforting, strategically tempting to treat the disaster as an exception caused by overextension, by weak Allied flanks, by bad weather, by Hitler's insistence on holding positions, by any number of factors. In that interpretation, the Soviet victory was less about Soviet strength than about German error. Fix the error, tighten the front, and the old logic might return. The winter of 1942-43 tested that hope. As Soviet offensives rolled forward in the south, German commanders faced a landscape of retreat and improvisation. Yet, in this chaos, a new pattern began to emerge, and it was unmistakable to those trained to see it. Soviet operations were becoming more integrated. Artillery preparation grew heavier and more deliberate. Tank forces, once scattered or misused, were now increasingly concentrated into larger mobile formations designed for exploitation. Infantry and armor coordination improved. Anti-tank defenses thickened. Air support, while still uneven, began to align more effectively with ground operations. The Red Army was not simply replenishing losses. It was refining its method of war. And that was the true meaning of rebuilding, not replacing what was destroyed, but constructing something better out of the wreckage. German generals began receiving intelligence estimates that no longer sounded like the desperate enemy of 1941. They spoke of new armies, new corps, reconstituted divisions, and a production rhythm that seemed to defy the devastation inflicted in the first months of invasion. German officers, who prided themselves on understanding military reality, were forced to confront a reality that felt almost offensive. The Soviet Union appeared to be generating fighting power at a scale Germany could not match. This recognition did not arrive as a single revelation. It arrived in fragments, in staff meetings, in memos, in conversations between officers who had begun to distrust optimistic projections. It arrived in the form of new Soviet units identified on the front, units that should not exist if earlier Soviet losses had been decisive. It arrived in the form of Soviet artillery barrages that suggested enormous ammunition stocks. It arrived in the form of tank losses that were absorbed and replaced again and again until German soldiers began to feel that destroying Soviet armor was like striking water. At the operational level, one of the most unsettling signs was Soviet depth. In 1941, German encirclements had worked because Soviet forces often lacked layered defenses and flexible reserves. By 1943, the Soviet approach increasingly emphasized defense in depth, multiple belts, fallback lines, mined approaches, anti-tank strong points, and carefully positioned reserves for counterattack. This was not just an engineering change. It was a strategic change rooted in the understanding that German strength lay in breakthrough and maneuver, and that those strengths could be blunted by forcing the Germans to fight through successive prepared zones for German generals. The Kursk salient became the clearest expression of the Soviet rebuild. After the winter battles stabilized, the German high command sought a way to regain the initiative. The salient around Kursk seemed to offer it, a protruding Soviet-held bulge that could be attacked from north and south, pinched off and turned into a massive encirclement. Such a victory might destroy Soviet forces in the region and restore the strategic balance at least temporarily. The plan, in concept, resembled earlier German successes. But now the context was different. The German army in the east was no longer the instrument of 1941. It had suffered attrition, lost experienced officers and non-commissioned leaders, and faced growing material shortages. Germany still fielded highly capable units, and new armored vehicles were introduced with expectations of technical advantage. But the war was no longer about isolated qualitative superiority. It was about sustained combat power over time. That meant Kursk was not just a battle. It was a test of whether Germany could still dictate the terms of the war, and it was here, in the planning and delaying of the operation, the German generals most clearly, learned perhaps against their will, that the Red Army was rebuilding faster than German decision-making could keep up with. Every delay gave the Soviet Union time to strengthen defenses, position reserves, and prepare counteroffensives. German planners delayed in part to assemble forces, to bring in new tanks, to restore battered divisions. Yet the same calendar that Germany needed was working against it. Soviet engineers dug. Soviet artillery was positioned. Mines were laid in numbers that turned entire approaches into lethal geometry. Anti-tank guns and infantry were integrated into defense networks. And behind the front, Soviet commanders held mobile reserves, tank armies, and mechanized corps ready not only to parry an attack, but to counterpunch once German